Sarah, let me ask you to could you tell us a little bit about who Evelyn De Morgan was and why was she so significant as an artist?
Yeah, thanks, Nicola, and good evening, everybody. I can see some names of people I recognise in the talk. So it's lovely to see everybody. Thank you for joining us. Yeah, it's a great question to kick things off, Nicola. De Morgan was first and foremost a professional artist. I think before we get into some of the subversive aspects of her work and some of the things that she was doing, that was her aim. And really, for a person of her social status and gender at the time she wanted to do that, there were a number of barriers stepping in her way. And I think the fact that she went on to be a professional artist as she had intended, exhibiting artworks widely at some of the standout galleries of the Victorian period, going on to have solo exhibitions in Germany and here in the UK, really do show that she'd overcome these barriers entirely to make it. And I think for that reason, she's significant. Like I said, she was exhibiting, she was selling her artworks to noteworthy people. A lot of MPs, politicians and lords and ladies owned her paintings before they came back to the foundation. But then when we add to that level that she was a woman and she was definitely living in a man's world, there was a real expectation that if women were to be artists, they would be painting twee watercolours at home and not exhibiting in oils at galleries. And then there was her social class. Being a woman of the upper classes, she was expected to be presented to society, to marry and to have a family of her own. And the fact that she rejected all of that in order to pursue her goals really is what make her extraordinary.
Yeah, and she chose subjects which were, as you say, not the sort of watercolors and sort of little drawings on her travels, but really mythological subjects, history paintings, that sort of thing, which was really a man's a world at the time, a male artist's preserve at the time, weren't they? And she also changed her name, I believe, to be less recognizable as a woman when she started wanting to sell her paintings. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So one of the first pictures that she ever exhibited at the Dudley Gallery was her reimagining of St. Catherine of Alexandria, and the relationship of that work to Raphael's picture of the same topic shows that she was really stabbing herself, at a really premier level. She fully believed in her skill and talent in order to take on, a Renaissance master with one of her earliest debuts in painting. Changing her name to Evelyn wasn't a direct change. That was her middle name. She was christened Mary Evelyn Pickering. But when she arrived at art school, we believe that she began using her more gender neutral middle name, to really make sure that she was recognised on her own merit rather than as a woman.
Well, that takes me on to I wanted to ask you about her training, because it's pretty extraordinary that she's drawing nudes, isn't it? At this time, male nudes, including male nudes. So what sort of training did she have, and how did this come about?
So within the literature on Evelyn De Morgan, a lot of information is pinned on the biography that her sister wrote about her in 1922. Her sister was 10 years younger than her, and this biography was published a number of years after her death. So you do have to take it with a pinch of salt. And in this biography, the sister sort of explains that Evelyn was really not encouraged by her mother in particular to become an artist, that she would say things like, "I want a daughter, not an artist." But really, I think there must have been some parental support there. Her father's diaries reveal that he paid for no fewer than 3 drawing tutors. We know that one of them was a chap called Green, to instruct his daughter in the study of artwork, and particularly in drawing. And then she was admitted to the National Art Training School in 1872 before starting at the Slade School of Art in 1873. So it's true that she was one of the first female students at the Slade. That often gets said about her, but actually she was one of the first students. The Slade had only opened a couple of years before she enrolled there. And it was actually the Slade that was revolutionary, really, and by product of her attending, it made her revolutionary. And the reason I say that is the Slade was the first art school to admit women and to admit them to the life room. And just to give you an indication of how taboo this was, they were only permitted to enter during the daytime. So at 5 p.m, no women allowed in the life school. Goodness knows what would have happened to them if they'd, seen a semi-draped figure after dark. And semi-draped is correct as well. So the men were not nude. And actually, in the Royal Academy schools, once they'd started permitting women to the life room, there were very strict guidelines in the Royal Academy schools meeting minutes about how the male should be draped and sort of the size of this nappy that they're put in. So I think that really puts into context that her being able to draw and paint the nude model was extraordinary. What's really extraordinary is how good she was at that. And I think the beautiful picture you've chosen to illustrate here, Nicola, on the right-hand side of Cadmus and Harmonia, Harmonia being a figure from mythology there that we see as this striking female nude. And I think particularly striking with its realism. So whilst at the Slade, De Morgan actually won a full scholarship for her studies there, which enabled her to attend other schools in the university. And we know that she took anatomy classes with aspiring physicians, which is just, again, so impressive that she was able to do that and could stomach it, I suppose. But the way she paints really is to put flesh on bones, and the way that this figure is proportionally a bit distorted based on classical sculpture, but the flesh of her abdomen and her torso in particular, and around her hips and thighs, is incredibly realistic. So yeah, I think she really did excel at drawing from life.
Yeah, it's a drawing I can see by somebody who really knows about women's bodies, because I think often you see male nudes and sometimes the breasts are sort of positioned very awkwardly on the sides. So but I mean, I'm really struck by this drawing because this painting, because she produces it in 1877. And I think it must be one of the first female nudes by a female artist, produced in Britain. I'm not entirely sure, but it's certainly very early, isn't it? And I believe that she used as a model her sister's governess. Is that right?
Yeah.
I was at a talk about her the other day, and the person giving it was saying that.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. So someone called Jane Hales, and she was already in the family's employment as a governess to this much younger sister who went on to write the biography. And I think that enabled the two of them to work together without the pressure or the issues in society of, obviously, artist model being quite clearly synonymous with prostitution. So Jane Hales was able to maintain her reputation, and De Morgan had access to a model without either of them having to tarnish their reputation in that way. It seems
pretty bohemian arrangement, though, even so at the time. Let's move on to the next thing. And she went to Florence, didn't she, several times? And it had a great impact, didn't it, on her art? Can you speak about that?
Yeah, of course. So the first time we know that she travelled to Italy, she was very young. She was still at the Slade School, and that was in 1874. So she was only 19 years old. And with her cousin Gertrude Spencer Stanhope, who was a sculptor, they travelled independently through France and Italy. And I think to send your 19-year-old daughter on a gap year, as it were, today, it's quite a big thing to undertake. So for two women to be doing it in that period is astonishing, really. They had the benefit that their uncle, the late pre-Raphaelite painter John Rodham Spencer Stanhope, was living in Italy at that time. He'd moved out there in 1873, or at least bought a villa there in 1873. So the two women did have a sponsor, I suppose, as it were, within the family that they could visit. But still, they travelled through Perugia to Assisi, and the works, I think, in Assisi, particularly of Giotto, had a big impact on her. And later, the Uffizi Gallery, the work of other Renaissance artists were very influential to her. Other early Renaissance artists like Fra Angelico, and then, as we see in the magnificent Flora on the left-hand side of this slide, the influence of Botticelli on her was enormous. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that Botticelli was particularly stylish at that time as well. She was an artist who worked very much within conventions of other art movements around her. And Flora is just, you know, an absolute tribute to this artist and to Florence, the city that she loved, because by 1890, with her husband, the ceramicist William De Morgan, she was spending 6 months of each year living in Florence. They had their own apartment and studio that they rented there. So a city that meant a great deal to her, I think.
Right. And I really want to come on to very briefly onto her marriage, because she was a great believer in women's suffrage, and I believe she sort of understood the pressures that women came under when they had children and got married, if they were sort of creative people, didn't she?
Yeah, absolutely. So her marriage to William de Morgan came in 1887 after a long engagement. They'd been engaged for 3 years, supposedly having met at a fancy dress party, which is a lovely sort of tale, and I think shows off a little bit of their personalities. But within that marriage, it was always very equal. I think some of that is down to the Women's Property Act being passed in 1882. So by the time William and Evelyn married, she was able to retain her personal wealth that she built up from inheritance and from the sale of her paintings. So that actually it was her that took out the lease on the house that the De Morgans lived in. That was in her name and her name alone, about 4 months before they married and moved into it. She was also able to give her husband a gift, an endowment towards his business of £4,000 in old money, so about £300,000 today. And really, without her investment into Morgan and Co., it would have ceased operation a good decade before it did. So her part in the story of the ceramics is really quite crucial, and it shows that they were a very equal partnership in their marriage. Her interest in supporting other women and seeing that perhaps outside of her own life, there was a much murkier picture. Started, I think, from being a young woman and wanting to break free of those conventions herself. But she found a true ally in William. In 1889, along with his mother and sister, who were also active in the suffrage movement, she signed the Declaration in favour of women's suffrage, so she's one of the first signatories on that document, and a later one in the 1890s. And lots of her paintings pick up on this idea of freedoms being absolutely restricted to women, and this picture in particular is just such a perfect example. We have a completely loveless marriage of convenience, and obviously very wealthy husband and wife, completely disjointed and separated by the composition and that lovely diagonal line that runs down through it. And what's echoed in the window that the woman so desperately looks out of is that composition again, but this time it's a joyful and triumphant one as this sort of Bacchanalian revel marches past the window. You can see them playing cymbals and they've got trumpets. But in the woman's own picture space, in the first picture plane there, she's absolutely mirrored in that image by the bird in the gilded cage. So a very obvious symbol alluding to her entrapment and sorrow, really, in this gilded cage that she herself lives in.
Here's another image which I just wanted to ask you briefly, and we will move on for those of you desperate to get to the gold drawings. We're getting there in just a minute, but I wanted to remark on this one. So I recently co-curated an exhibition at the Henry Moore Institute in Leeds about sculpture in the Victorian era. And there was a whole room about femme fatale, male images of femme fatale in sculpture. And so I was very interested to see that Evelyn De Morgan also produces several paintings of these so-called femme fatales. So here we have Medea. And I compared it to the Delacroix, because when I chatted to Sarah the other day and we talked about this painting, and I think Sarah's take on it is on Evelyn's painting is very interesting. So tell us what you were telling me the other day, Sarah, about how you see this.
The Medea, as per Delacroix, is often she's a figure from Greek mythology, and she's often depicted as a completely evil woman, as her husband had an affair, drove her to insanity, and she killed her children by him. And so Delacroix obviously captures that beautifully, these wriggling cherub-like boys trying to get away from this sort of evil looking sorceress, sometimes she's referred to as well. Whereas in De Morgan's picture, that's gone. We've got doves of innocence flying around her, flowers of beauty, and the way she looks away from the viewer is very different to the Delacroix. She's not watching for anybody coming. She's walking straight out and facing the viewer, but her gaze is completely distracted. And I think that all of that symbolism and that composition really points to the fact that there's a reason that comes before her making that decision to do it, and that is that she's been wronged, and she's been driven to this almost by this, what I think we refer to now as, you know, sort of domestic abuse, gaslighting by the husband figure, and I think it is a much more sympathetic view. I think it's important to say when this picture was first exhibited by De Morgan, it was accompanied by a passage from the Morris poem when he rewrote the story of Jason and the Argonauts, and that in itself is quite a sympathetic view of not only Medea but of Circe as well, the Greek sorceress.
Interesting. I just thought it was an interesting comparison to see, because a lot of the male sculptors we looked at and painters, you know, like Rossetti, were very, very taken by Delacroix's depiction of Medea. So let's move on. One more question about her generally, which I think is fascinating. So she was very, very interested in spiritualism, wasn't she? And the ideas of Swedenborg, I think, about light and progress of the spirit, wasn't she? And so I chose this painting, Lux in Tenebris, and also another one, The Thorny Path, and just wanted to ask you a little bit about her interest in spiritualism.
Yeah, she did believe, I think, absolutely in spiritualism, the fact that spirits of the dead could be contacted. She practiced automatic writing with her husband William, and they published that volume in 1910. And really, yeah, that comes from that Swedenborgian example of the human life is progress for the soul, and like resolving what's good and what's evil, the soul can be enlightened and emancipated from the body. Lux in Tenebris, I don't need to describe what's going on here. It's really a case of a picture's worth 1,000 words. We've got this bright light shining from the grim darkness with these crocodiles circling at the bottom of the picture, that direct contrast between the heavenly and the earthly. The thorny path has much more complex imagery. This woman sort of on the precipice of this step with some stairs behind her, and what you can't see is just a little peacock perched on the balustrade behind her, peacock being a symbol for eternity. And I think we're supposed to question whether the woman is about to enter this thorny path of life, the trials and tribulations of life, or whether she's ready to turn her back on it and ascend on her spiritual journey. So an interesting one that really shows the dilemma of a lot of people at the time, I think, grappling with Christianity, scientific intervention, and spiritualist ideals.
And I think it's really interesting that in all of these paintings, she gives the woman a very, very strong role. She gives women agency. They're the ones that seem to lead this sort of spirit, this progress of the spirit. Because the Lux in Tenebris, I mean, often this kind of painting was a painting of Christ, so a male figure, wasn't it? But here we have a female figure. So let's move on now to the gold paintings. And this is the first one, and I chose this one as the first one because it actually refers to the Thorny Path, the painting that we just saw a black and white reproduction of earlier. Can you tell us a little bit about the gold paintings and why she produced them and what they're made of? Excuse me.
Yeah, I'll start with what they're made of first of all, because that's maybe the most interesting thing about them. So the paper we think was pre-bought or manufactured in this sort of dark brown, grey kind of tonal paper, and then the material that she's used to create the luminous gold effect is probably, or we think, a material of her own invention. So she was buying gold pigment in cakes of gold, so these dry pellets, grinding that down and using something like either a tempera or a gum arabic in order to create a thick paint that could be applied in absolutely minute detail with a small brush to really create a very dense pictorial image with lots of this rich color, so that the light sort of reflects back at you from them when you're in front of them. They're absolutely marvelous things. There are some areas in some of them where it almost appears like she's burnished the paper as well with the material she was making. So maybe she had a method by which she could make almost a more solid pastel or crayon in order to do that. So the texture of them as well, she's using the materiality of the paper with its texture, but also working into that with the gold to make the image.
And she uses them in two ways, doesn't she? So this one seems to be a copy after the thorny path, but sometimes she uses them as preparatory drawings, doesn't she? As in the one we'll look at next.
So some of the drawings predate oil paintings of the same name. Some of them are standalone, they don't refer to a known oil painting, and some of them predate the oil painting. So we have them before, not at all, and after. So in that way, I don't necessarily think that she was making them in preparation for an oil. So they're not compositional, referred to as a compositional study, and it is a work on paper that shares a composition with an oil. But I think she was making them for quite different reasons. And the previous slide, you showed a pencil sketch for that single figure. That is one of her preparatory drawings, where she's using dark and light chalk to create the tonal balance she can refer to in her oil painting. Sometimes we have highly finished portrait pastels, which would make up the figures in her larger oils. But the gold drawings were standalone, and in 1889 she had an exhibition of them at the Fine Arts Society, which definitely sort of says to me that she wanted these to be understood as artworks in their own right. And in addition to that, some of them had original labels on the back of them which say whether or not they are for sale. So again, she was experimenting with different media for different visual effects, first and foremost, I think.
And this one's quite an interesting one, isn't it? You can see, I put this detail so you could really see, we can see the way she's using the material very closely as well.
Yeah, an excellent image of that one that you've got, Nicola, because if you look at the face, you'll see what I mean about the burnishing and really picking up on the texture of the paper, almost to make something quite sculptural. But then if you look further down onto the part of the dress that just covers the breast of the female figure, you can see those long lines that have been built up in paint with a brush, probably quite a wet use of quite a thick version of the material she was making in order to make those folds in very delicately in the fabric. The image on the right hand side shows that full figure, quite an unusual one in the series of gold drawings because it's picked up with two different coloured chalks, so blue for the earth on which Opis stands as a fertility deity, a Mother Earth type figure, and we see her hair on top of the world. So that picks up on this idea that she really did put women in the centre of her compositions, and then this red cloak to really balance or give this extra warmth to the gold, and you can see that that's worked in throughout the picture. I always think this is quite an interesting one because there is no oil painting that it corresponds to. So fingers crossed that means we're yet to find one. But failing that, it means that she was using this incredibly difficult medium that she created herself to make something that is akin to a private devotional piece. And it's documented that her and her husband never had children, and I wonder if the fact this is a fertility deity that was kept in her own private collection as a private, almost devotional piece in this brilliant gold, maybe hints at the fact that the De Morgans either wanted to or couldn't have children, or whether there might be a miscarriage in the marriage that we'll never know about. I'm very quick to say that's pure speculation on my part. It's not evidenced anywhere. And sometimes I think you can read too much biographically into artworks, but a stunning picture nonetheless.
But there was very much a medieval tradition, wasn't there, of having, I mean, particularly images of St. Margaret, wasn't there, of these as a fertility sort of to evoke fertility. I think it was St. Margaret. So I just chose a few others which I thought were rather wonderful. I don't know if you want to say anything about any of these. I mean, this one interested me particularly because of the armor of the saint is very similar to the armor that appears in some of the sculptures that I was looking at. in the exhibition. You know, the Victorian sort of fascination with these sort of medieval images. But so there's this one, and this is also about pacifism, isn't it?
Yeah, so to pick up on
Yeah.
the armor, we know that she made trips to Hampton Court Palace to look at tapestries, and we believe that that's where she did some of her armor studies based on a 15th century German Maximilian suit of armor, so showing her interest in medieval history as well as Italian Renaissance history. But the figure here with the shining suit of armor is meant to sort of embody all soldiers, painted at the time of the Boer War, and named Victoria Dolorosa, so the sorrow in victory. And she's picking up here on the fact that even though the war has been waged and won, the human suffering behind that is always going to make this a terrible sort of smudge on humanity.
Mm. And then these two are rather wonderful. Soul's Prison House. I don't think I've got the, have I got, oh, I have got the title of the one on the right. It's hiding there. Gloria in Excelsis. Two others. The Soul's Prison House. What is that? Is that a Swedenborgian sort of image?
Absolutely.
Do we know what that is? Yeah.
We have the figure of a young woman trapped in a prison awaiting her emancipation through this barred window. So it's quite obvious iconography that can also be interpreted as the fact that it is a woman. So a woman awaiting her emancipation very much fits in with her socio-political views as well as her spiritualist ones. Right. So of interest that the scroll in this is actually made of a silver pigment, probably along the same method as the gold pigment was. So that one's quite an interesting one to see in person because you get the contrast of the silver and the gold.
Yes.
And then we move on to another scroll, but this time the scroll is in gold as well, and it's an angel holding the Gloria, the word of God, sort of sharing the news of the birth of Jesus, and the angels came to present that to the shepherds in the nativity story. And it's just such an incredible image. The range of different textures in this artwork, if you do get to Leighton House to see the exhibition, is just mind-blowing, really, that from the downy feathers on the angels' wings to the cherubs' faces to the halos, everything has been approached with a different method of applying this gold pigment of her own in order to create a very deep image. So, you know, for a two-dimensional study, there's a great richness and a great depth to this piece achieved by her mark making.
There's one more image that I just wanted to highlight here, and I think the reason it fascinates me is because last year or a couple of years ago, the Uffizi did a display of Botticelli's drawings of Dante, the Paradise and the Paradiso and Inferno, and these really remind me of that, and I wondered if she'd actually seen those drawings.
Quite possibly. I don't know that for sure, but it would make sense based on this drawing that, you know, the imagery that we see of these absolute sort of poor and destitute figures being either led away to some kind of horrific underworld or being emblazoned by the rays of salvation. The contrasts in them really do pick up, don't they, in that Dante-esque either imagery or narrative.
Yes, the sort of kind of ascending a mountain, isn't there? The sort of the idea of kind of going up through the different levels. Yeah. Well, I think it's time to let the audience ask some questions.